Hi, I'm Rachel and welcome back to Auxhart Gardening. Today I'm talking about how to know when to start your seeds. It is January and coming up next month is the time when a lot of people in my area are going to be starting seeds. And if this is your first year gardening or your first time trying to garden from seed, it might be really confusing to you as to when you should start all of your seeds. And I will say, while there is a bit of nuance and experience involved, it's really not too difficult to start things from seed, and it's also way cheaper than buying started plants, especially if you are growing vegetables to sort of offset your grocery bill. Growing from seed is usually the way that you do that because started plants can be pretty expensive. It's also worth noting that growing from seed year after year, saving the seeds from your garden and replanting those, will actually help develop over time a version of that variety that does better in your climate than maybe the packet from the store, which was grown in a greenhouse who knows where. Whereas the seeds that are growing in your garden year over year will sort of self-select for the ones that do the best in your environment. So you'll notice most seed packets have information on the back that includes when to start the seeds. Usually it'll say start indoors 6 to 8 weeks before frost, or 6 to 10 weeks, or whatever it is. 6 to 8 is like the most common one that you see. And from that, you might assume that you need to know when your frost date is and wonder how do you get that. It's actually very simple. You can literally just Google it. For me, I live near a university that actually has a very good agricultural program, and so they have a very good website with the information for all of the counties in South Carolina. But this information is accessible via Google and other websites. Maybe the Farmer's Almanac for you will have your last and first frost dates every year. So the Clemson website actually has the 50% chance frost date and the 10% chance frost date. So I went ahead and circled both of those for me, just so I have that range in mind of when the last frost is going to be. You won't be able to find that information for everywhere, but if you're in South Carolina, you can at least find that on the Clemson website. So from my 50% chance frost date, which is the earlier date, I went ahead and counted back 6 weeks. And that, I would say, is the earliest that I would start most of my seeds. This, given the 10% chance frost date, is 6 to 8 weeks before it would be okay to put most frost tender plants outside. Okay, so now that we've established how to figure out when to start your seeds based on the advice on your seed packet, let's address why it's important to follow the advice on your seed packet. You may feel like, oh, well, this is just a guideline, and yeah, that is true, but it's a guideline for a reason. So you would think if you could start your seeds earlier, you would have bigger plants to put out, which would then maybe fruit sooner for you, or fruit longer through the season. And yes, that is true. It is very true. But the trade-off here is that you need the space inside for those larger plants. If you have a small plant, you can keep it in a small pot, and you can keep a lot of small pots in an area. Whereas if you started your plants sooner, you would have to pot them up into bigger pots as they got bigger, and then not as many big pots fit in that same area. And you see where I'm going with this. You run out of space in your warm room, under your lights, etc. And so the reason that the guidance on the seed packet is the way it is not because that's the way you have to do it for the plant to grow well, but because that is the best balance between getting your plant started early and being able to keep it in a small pot in most cases. There are some exceptions. For example, this eggplant, it says on the back here, start indoors in bright light 8 to 12 weeks before last frost date. Heat mat helps to warm soil and speed germination. Setting out larger transplants helps to fight pest pressure. So, in the case of this eggplant, they are suggesting that you start sooner and intentionally get these larger plants before you put them out because it will help with the pest pressure. But you as a gardener have to keep in mind, okay, I could do this, I could follow the advice and have that extra protection against the pest pressure, but maybe you don't have the room to do that. And so you could trade off and say, okay, well, I'm going to start with smaller plants, and maybe I will have the room for a couple more if I keep them all small, and if one of them gets eaten, I have a spare. Or you're just going to take your chances. I don't have the room. I'm going to take my chances, start it 6 weeks instead of 8 weeks, and just see what happens. Something else you should absolutely consider when you're thinking about this advice on the back of seed packets is what your weather actually looks like right after that last frost date. Is it going to warm up really fast, or is it still going to be a little cool, like close to freezing, but not really frosting at night, but still kind of cool? Because it makes a difference to some plants. While all of these frost tender plants, as long as it doesn't frost, they won't die, that doesn't mean that they're going to be happy. And so for me, I have to think about this specifically with peppers. Peppers are a heat-loving plant, and they can survive cool temperatures, but they don't really like it. And they're not going to get as big, they're not going to produce as well if it's cool outside. So the packet says that I can start them 6 to 10 weeks before the last frost date. However, I am probably not going to start them that soon because I'm going to be putting them out later. For me, I generally wait all the way until May, which is another 4 weeks on my calendar past my last frost date before putting out things like peppers. And I have found that even though they are started a little later, putting them out in the heat that they like accelerates their growth, and they do just fine. Whereas if I were to put them out sooner, like, sure, I'm technically giving them more time to grow, but they're not going to grow as fast, and the plant overall is just not going to be as hardy and sturdy. But another common one, tomatoes, for example, they can be put out as soon as it's warm enough for them to not freeze to death. They are pretty tolerant of the cool temperatures, and it doesn't affect them nearly as much as peppers. So your tomatoes can go out 2, 3, maybe even 4 weeks if you're feeling lucky before your peppers, at least in my area. And that's something I have to keep in mind when I am looking at the recommendations on these seed packets. As with a lot of things in gardening, these things I'm telling you come a little bit from experience, and they also come a little bit from talking to other people who live in your area. I might not have figured out that putting out peppers in the warmer weather makes them do better unless I had heard somebody else talk about it first. So maybe I can be that person for you. But if I don't live in your area, I'm in South Carolina. If you are up north, the Pacific Northwest, like, my advice is not going to be as relevant to you in these specific things. But you can still take this and say, I'm going to go find somebody who knows about my area and learn from them. But it's also perfectly valid if you want to just try things in your garden and learn what works over time. That's what most of us do. We're not like starting out gardening knowing more than you do now if this is your first time gardening. We have just had that experience built up over years. And unfortunately, because there is such a variation in climate from area to area and soil and all these things, it's really hard to give somebody a comprehensive guide to gardening that doesn't include experience, because as much as I would love to tell you exactly what to do, I can't. You have to learn a little bit for yourself. Now, you might find, again, people in your area that know what's going on. Maybe somebody in your area has written a book about your specific area. That would be kind of ideal to learn from. But there is not going to be this resource for every single area, and you might have to grind out over a few years what works best for you. Okay, with that being said, I want to touch on the fact that you do not have to start every seed before the frost. You don't have to start every seed indoors. There's some that actually do a lot better if you plant them directly in the soil after the frost. Things like beans and corn and squash are going to be some of the most common ones that you see direct seeded. And that's a little bit of the fact that they are such large seeds, but it is also due to the fact that they really germinate quickly, and the time to produce is not as long as something like peppers or tomatoes, which really take a long growing season. And the reason a lot of us start those indoors, right, is because we don't have the long growing season that's required to start them from seed in the ground. You really could if you had the long enough growing season between your frost dates, but especially for tomatoes and peppers, you will probably not get as much of a harvest because these plants grow their harvest every time you pull from them. And those of you who live in colder areas, I mean, even most of us in North America, we have never seen what happens to a pepper if you let it go longer than a year. And in a lot of places where it's warmer, they actually have like almost like bush-sized, tree-sized pepper plants because they just keep getting bigger and producing more the longer they have to grow. Of course there's a limit, but you see where I'm going with this. You don't have to start it before the frost, but it is pretty helpful if you do. Whereas with something like beans or corn, starting them before the frost date, they grow really fast, so you would run out of room really fast. And because they grow fast, there's not really that much point in using your space to start them early. All right, and I'm gonna stop there because I'm gonna try and keep this a pretty short, easily referenceable video, but if you have any questions, my comment section is always open. I read every single comment and try to respond to as many as I can. Thank you guys so much for watching. Subscribe to support the channel, and I will see you next time. Until then, happy gardening.